G'day and welcome to another episode of Grumpy Old Bloke, the vinyl collection. Now today we're embarking upon the letter D. Now D is going to be quite an interesting one because it's quite an extensive representative letter within my record collection. So what I'm going to do, rather than do it in an alphanumeric order as I have done previously through these episodes, I'm going to put the albums together more sort of grouped according to style, according to type. Gives us more of a smooth story between the groups and the albums that are featured today. Today we're going to be featuring particularly on the very late 70s and early 80s. And for those of you that are regulars of this show will know that that is indeed the time when music was indeed at its best. And hopefully we can explore some of the reasons as to why that was today. 1979 was a particularly interesting time for music. The new wave of British heavy metal was just in its infancy and just beginning to spread its wings at the time. No band was more involved with the new wave of British heavy metal than the first band that we're going to feature today, and that is Def Leppard. Def Leppard released a self-titled EP in 1979, and that was swiftly followed in 1980 by this album, On Through the Night. This is Def Leppard's first studio album. It was produced by Tom Allom, who also had worked with Black Sabbath and Judas Priest of note during that time. This contains the tracks Wasted and Rocks Off, both of which were on was on that EP. Other tracks from this album include Hello America and When the Walls Come Tumbling Down. Hello America was a single that I bought. It was the first Def Leppard product that I bought. However, it actually brought them into a lot of disrepute or out of favour. The British audience is particularly partisan, shall we say, and it was felt that of the new wave British heavy metal bands, Def Leppard were probably trying to pander too much to the American market for their taste. Was that true? Well, I think history went on to show that may well have been the case. However, this is the back of the album. The boy's looking incredibly young there. If you look at Joe Elliott, he looks like he should still be at school. And looking at the track listing, there you go. The album itself comes in. I haven't re-sleeved this one yet, so I'm running out of inner sleeves, so I need to do that. The inner cover with the lyrics and liner notes, as per usual. The other side there, looking at the band, you're so young. As you can see, Pete Willis and Steve Clark, the original guitarists, are both on this album and were both responsible for most of the writing that goes on there. The label itself is a classic Spaceship, I think we refer to that too. The Spaceship label for Phonogram Vertigo. So there you go, Def Leppard's first album. I was sort of buying into it at the time. I was myself in London a fair bit for my own purposes at the time, and was extremely fortunate to mix with a number of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, not least Def Leppard, Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, and I'm sure stories will come out as we go through. I had a bit of a strained relationship with one member of Def Leppard. I won't get into that story here for legal reasons, but let's say most of the band were really cool guys. One of them less so, in my opinion. But I'm sure if we met nowadays, we'd have a beer and talk about the past, and he wouldn't even remember who I was, so it's irrelevant. So, hey, first album, On Through the Night. Whilst this is really a joyous thing for me to go through my record collection, it does actually highlight to me some gaps in it. Of great surprise was me coming through the Def Leppard selection that I actually don't have their second album, High and Dry, which is interesting because it is actually my favourite Def Leppard album. I do have it on CD, of course, but that's not what this show's all about. So, note to self, better get yourself a copy of that, mate. In January 1983, after the first two albums, one which was criticised for being a little bit too American, the second album, High and Dry, was a little bit more rocky, a little bit more back to new wave of British heavy metal, if you like. But the third album, which came out, as I said, in January 1983, had a little bit more of a sort of a taste of things to come. That album was Pyromania. Now, Pyromania is a definite leap towards Americana AOR radio airplay style. It's still a very good album, and it very much serves as a part one or an entree as to what was to come next. As far as this album's concerned, this is a British first release. There are a number of ways of telling about the first release, not least of which, during the recording of this album, the original guitarist Pete Willis was sacked towards the end of the making of it for excessive alcohol use, which in any rock band nowadays doesn't seem... Anyway, let that fly. So what you can tell on the back, Phil was actually replaced by... Pete Willis was replaced by Phil Collin, who gets his own photo down here. And up here, the original picture of Joe Elliott, as you can see, has a picture of Pete Willis behind them. That was actually changed on the later edition, so this is an original. As far as the track listing is concerned, I don't know if you can even see it there. Photograph would be a track that you would probably know. Foolin', Die Hard, The Hunter, Rock of Ages, they still play live. So look, there's a number of really good tracks on here. I prefer this to the one that followed. This is probably a little bit more back to basics. It's a little bit more raw than raw as a heavily produced album by Mutt Lange can get, compared to what was coming. I actually do like this album. It's a good, still listen to album. Inner Sleeve, yeah, a little bit boring. I'm sure it's making some kind of statement about redness. The actual label itself is on the classic orange Vertigo, as opposed to the Spaceship, which is the original British version of it, as I said. Overall, third studio album, 1983, Pyromania. Really good, solid album. The fourth studio album to come out by Def Leppard was the big one. This is the one that made them a mega stars and a huge group worldwide. The album is, of course, Hysteria. The journey to this album was indeed a difficult birth. It took approximately 4 years to record. During that period, all sorts of stuff happened. We had the lead guitarist Steve Clark, who died not long after this album was released, who had a significant drug problem. Famously, Rick Allen, the drummer, lost his arm in a car accident. Their original producer, Mutt Lange, came in, was suffering from exhaustion, left. Jim Steinman came in, and they recorded a lot of stuff with Jim Steinman, after which the band were not happy with it, so all of that stuff got abandoned. So Mutt Lange then came back in and finished the album, and I believe even Joe Elliott got mumps during the period. So I'm sure there was other stuff as well. There was all sorts of stuff going on, but this album, when it was finally released, became by far the biggest album Def Leppard had ever made, and to this day remains one of the biggest selling albums in the rock sphere, at least, ever made. It sold a basquillion metric tons, which is a lot of albums. The back of its album itself is, again, it's a little bit more stylized. You wouldn't be able to read the track listing on there, I wouldn't imagine. I can read the track listings to you. Tracks that you would know as Women, Rocket, Animal, Love Bites, which is a huge one in the US especially. Pour Some Sugar on My, Armageddon It, Gods of War, Don't Shoot Shotgun, Run Riot, Hysteria, Excitable, and Love and Affection. There were, I believe, 7 singles pulled from this album up in all. So, as you can imagine, a huge commercial success for the band. Had an opposite effect on the hardcore fans, who also thought that they'd gone too radio friendly, I suppose. But look, you can't argue with the band. It was a creative genius that made that album, and it's still a great listening to these days. Inner Sleeve, usual liner notes down there, nothing in particular. A few more on the other side. The band on stage. The album cover is on. They are still with Vertigo here, but they've got their own personalised label on that one. So as I said, it's a brilliant album. There is no argument about that. It attracted a huge crowd to Def Leppard, and made them stadium stars, and even recently, as I think even less than 10 years ago, they were playing a residency as Las Vegas, and I think they were presenting Hysteria pretty much in full then. So it's an album which really has stood the test of time. It's very much of its age, but it was an absolute piece of genius. It's a piece of art in its own right. Such a classic album is Hysteria, or was Hysteria, whatever the past tense is. They re-released it in 2007 as a deluxe package. This is obviously a gatefold sleeve. Everything about the external album cover is the same as the original British version. The major difference is this comes as a 2-album collection, same number of tracks as there was on the original album, only they get the 180-gram slow remaster process treatment, and also comes on orange vinyl, which was that orange or yellow? I don't know, it depends on your eyesight, which is rather nice. I don't know if you see the other one as well, but it's also the same colour. So an awful lot of albums are getting this 30-year, 40-year, 50-year treatment, and I, for one, am really, really pleased with it, because the re-releases, more often than not, are much higher quality pressings, and usually digitally remastered from the masters, which gives a really, really good quality album. And some of these albums, you know, are 30, 40 years old. I mean, I've always looked after my albums, but, you know, they do tend to age a little bit if you're not careful. So that's a really interesting release. So that's Def Leppard, one of the most important, or one of the most influential, or certainly one of the biggest bands of the new wave of heavy metal. Now we move to 1983, when we talk of demons and wizards and rainbows and all sorts of unicorny things. We are treated to one of the greatest albums, I would say greatest rock albums of all time. Ronnie James Dio had left Black Sabbath. Tired of playing for other people, he decided to form his own band, and that band, of course, was Dio, named after one of the greatest voices in rock. Yeah, who do you compare him to? Amazing voice. Fortunate enough to see him live a number of times. I was also fortunate enough to share a beer with him on a couple of occasions as well, and can say he was an absolutely delightful man, a complete gentleman, and his size defied the voice. He didn't need a microphone to fill an arena. Absolutely incredible. So this album, Holy Diver, it's iconic. Which is the first of the many albums to appear with the demon on the front, known as Murray, to all his chums. This album is a classic. It's an absolute must, and would be in many people's top 10 rock albums of all time. The band consisted of Ronnie James Dio, obviously, Vinny Appice, who'd come with Ronnie from Black Sabbath, who's also a very well accomplished drummer. Jimmy Bain on bass, who had played with Ronnie James Dio in Rainbow, and also a newcomer, Vivian Campbell, who had played with a band called Sweet Savage from the new wave of British heavy metal. Now, I'm extremely fortunate. I'll tell you a little story after that of having met the whole band on a couple of occasions. But anyway, more to this album for now. Holy Diver, an absolute classic. One day I'd like to get this as a leg tattoo, but you know, money, time, pain, all of those things. The back of the album is as such. You can read the track listing there. Stand Up and Shout, Holy Diver, Gypsy Caught in the Middle, Don't Talk to Strangers, Straight Through the Heart, Invisible, Rainbow in the Dark, Shame on the Night. There is not a bad track on this album. It is brilliant from beginning to end. Highly recommended. As far as the inner cover is concerned, it's a montage of photos, certainly for Ronnie from the Rainbow and Black Sabbath days, and on the other side as well. And the label itself, quite a boring Vertigo label. There you go. Not much else I can say about this album, apart from it is an absolute classic. It's certainly in my top 10 greatest studio albums of all time. An absolute must for any rock collector. I was very fortunate. I went to see Dio as a band. I'd seen Dio play with Rainbow. I'd seen Dio play with Black Sabbath. Was a big fan. As a not very good, but as a budding lead singer myself, I admired the man enormously. Went along to see them in Southampton many years ago on the Holy Diver tour, and was fortunate enough to get backstage afterwards, and I got chatting to Vivian Campbell, who is just a lovely, lovely guy, just so accommodating, really, really nice. I ended up getting invited back to the hotel to spend the evening with some of the guys, and had a couple of beers with Vivian, and absolutely lovely guy. And as a result of that meeting, I was introduced to Ronnie James Dio, who was gracious and just an absolute gentleman. Jimmy Bain was at the bar holding it up, but said a good day to me, and some Scottish brogue. And my best mate, I was over in the corner as a drummer chatting to Vinny Appice, and they had a great night. So the guys were absolutely fantastic, so accommodating. A year later, maybe 2 years later, on the next tour, I was down in Portsmouth to go and catch them down there on the Last in Line tour, and was really, really touched that Vivian remembered me from having spent an evening with him a year before, and very kindly invited us back again. So I have to say I've spent a very pleasant couple of evenings in the company of these chaps, and as well as being brilliant musicians, I can honestly say, despite what happened between Vivian and Ronnie later on, my impression of them was extremely positive. Lovely guys. What do you do when you've made an absolute classic? And in my opinion, Holy Diver is a 10. I won't hear any word against it. It's a classic. So if you've made a 10, what do you do? Well, you do your best to come up with another one. This is Last in Line, which is the second album by Dio, solo band, and has exactly the same band lineup as the last album, Holy Diver, with the addition of Claude Schnell, who was a keyboard player, who was originally with Rough Cut, I think, who were another American band around at that sort of time. Actually, Rough Cut, I'm going off script here, not that I have a script, but I think Paul Shortino was the lead singer of Rough Cut, and if I'm right, and I'll check that later, I think Paul Shortino was also the guy in the Spinal Tap movie wearing all white walking through that the band dissed as it had gone after it. I could be completely wrong. I'll check that. However, this was a follow up to Holy Diver, Last in Line, 1984. Track listing on the back. Now, this is not as strong as Holy Diver, then you can't really expect it to be. For the only tracks on there that I'm not too keen on are on side 2, although most of side 2 is still pretty strong. All of side 1 is really strong on this album. It's a really good follow-up. I just feel sorry for bands in some ways when they bring out an absolute classic. Fantastic for them at the same time. How do you follow that up? Anyway, inside sleeve. There we go. Various pictures. And yes, I have checked to see if I'm in there. No, I'm not. And again, Vertigo label. Again, really good album. I would say it was Holy Diver Part 2, but not quite as strong. I'd probably give that... Well, I'm not going to start rating my albums because I'll be here forever. But it's not a 10, but it's still a really good album and a really good follow-up. Continuing my theory that good albums come in threes, the third of that particular group was this one. This one came out in 1985. Sorry, let's try and get the glare off you there. This is Sacred Heart. This is the third studio album by Dio, and also contains exactly the same lineup as the previous album. So the same as the first album plus Claude Schnell. This album is a little bit... For me, it's the weakest of the three. I'll let you have a look at the track listing there. The Sacred Heart, the track listing is extremely good. Rock and Roll Children is extremely good on there as well. Other than that, it's okay. I mean, it's a good solid album. It's good listening to, but for me, there's not a lot that stands out significantly on this. What I will say of during this album, or just before they recorded this album, Jimmy Bain and Vivian Campbell wrote the Hearing Aid track Stars. I have that here somewhere on 12-inch. I'll dig it out for you at some point. Which, if you don't know about, was the heavy metal equivalent of the Feed the World thing, but much, much better, and had a list of guitarists on that album, and vocalists is phenomenal. It's not an album. On that track is absolutely phenomenal. So if you've never heard it, look it up on one of the providers if you haven't got a copy of it. Absolutely brilliant. However, this was the last album Vivian Campbell was in the band for. He was replaced by Craig Goldie, and I believe Craig Goldie appears on one of the tracks on here as Vivian was leaving the band a little bit acrimoniously. Vivian went on to join Whitesnake briefly, and he ended up with Def Leppard. So can you see the connection there? That's brilliant. There we are. And there you go. There's the inner sleeve. Back with lyrics on there to Sacred Heart. And again on Vertigo. So a little bit of a disappointment for me after the first two albums, especially after the first one. And I actually stopped following Dio. Well, I didn't stop following them. Obviously paid interest to them. If they were on tour, I'd go along. I'd go to festivals and saw them. Saw Ronnie at a number of festivals, and the man never lost it. Absolutely amazing voice. One of the greatest in rock, if not the best in rock. It depends on your particular taste. But there we go. Dio, a significant contributor to rock and heavy metal in the early 80s. As we mentioned before, the late 70s, early 80s was a prolific time for many, many bands, and an awful lot of bands were overlooked. One of those bands that were in that period, they weren't new wave of British heavy metal, but they were certainly present in the early 80s, was an American band that, for me, were very exciting. I saw them support, I think it was the Scorpions, in the early days, and as a result of seeing them, I went out and bought this album. This album is Tooth and Nail, and it's by Dokken. Dokken essentially consists of Don Dokken on vocals, George Lynch on guitar, and Jeff Pilson on bass. They've had a number of musicians pass through the band over the years. One of the things that really held Dokken back was the fact that Don Dokken and George Lynch both have issues with each other. Many say there are ego issues. I've never met the guys, so I can't make any comment on them. However, they made bloody good music together. This album was thrown in very much with the hair metal and glam metal of the time, and maybe image-wise they might have been a bit that way, but this is much, much heavier than the sort of stuff that was around at the time. Picture of the band on the back. I don't know that you can necessarily see the track listing there. Oh, yes, you can. For me, the beginning of this album, the Without Warning into Tooth and Nail, is just brilliant. It's one of those things that still gets me after all these years. But there's some really Heaven Comes Down, Alone Again, absolutely brilliant tracks on this album. It's very much of its time. It is very 80s, but it still stands up pretty well today. It still sounds pretty heavy. And Dokken are together, I believe. I read somewhere today that they were touring again. I'm assuming that George Lynch and Don Dokken have their own buses, and they don't actually have a partition on stage. I don't know what it is that keeps them apart. Inner Sleeve, however, isn't that creepy. The usual stuff on the back. There's the lyrics to the song, and it's on Elektra. So there we go, on a standard British Elektra. This is the British release of it. So yeah, 1984, he said, checking his list. 1984 this came out, and was I think they were a band that were probably overlooked. I always saw Dokken, and I saw them live a number of times, but I only ever saw them in a support slot. I do remember, however, one day seeing them at Wembley, I think with AC/DC. The house lights were still up, and people were just finding their seats, and I'm assuming one of the roadies threw on the PA, and George Lynch was warming up, and he was doing hammer-ons and double taps a la Eddie Van Halen. I don't think he even realised the audience was listening, and most of us just stood there stunned thinking, whoa, what is going on? This guy is phenomenal, and George really is a good guitarist. He's one of the great shredders. And Don does have a very good, powerful, melodic voice as well. So it's just a shame, in a way, that they probably, due to their own activities, didn't really get as far as perhaps they should have done. Now, the album we've just looked at from Dokken was their second album. Their first album, for some reason, I don't have. Their third album, for some reason, I don't have, but I do have the fourth album. This is Back for the Attack, the fourth album, exactly the same lineup as on the last album we looked at, including the drummer Mick. I don't know if you can read the track listing on the back there, maybe you can. This album contains some of their real strong material as well, including Kiss of Death, Standing in the Shadows, Mr. Scary, which is that is a live highlight of George Lynch playing. There's some really, really good tracks on this album, and just adds to the fact for me that this was a really, really strong band. The inner cover is thus, and on back there as well, and I believe this one's also on Elektra. Yes, it is. So there we go. So Kevy has homework. I've got to go and pick up somehow. I've got to get their first album and their third album to almost complete the collection, but I do have one more exciting one to look at. As we all know, if you're not a band that counts if you haven't released a live album, ideally a double live album from the best period of your career. Dokken had 4 studio albums to this point, and in 1988 they released this. This is Beast from the East, and it was recorded on 10 different dates on the Japanese leg of their Back for the Attack tour. Inside is not all that exciting, to be honest with you, just liner notes generally speaking there, and on the back, as you can see, as far as track listing's concerned, it contains all of their favourite songs from the period, and also is a fun exhibit of just how good a live unit they were, both from all perspectives. I mean, Jeff Pilson's a great bassist, Mick Brown, a really solid drummer, and then of course you've got Don Dokken and George Lynch, you can't really go wrong. And George Lynch live, whoa, boy, did that boy know how to play. As far as the inner sleeves are concerned, they're not very interesting. They're just sort of generic Elektra covers, and the same for the albums themselves. The album itself is a really solid, great live album. Look, it's a classic 80s double live album. What can you say? It's when all bands will bring out the best live albums. I strongly suggest that if you've not heard Dokken before, this is a really good place to start, because essentially it's a best of and then playing live, which is the way all good bands should be. I'm not too sure. It was around about this time. I think it might have been 1988 that they played Donington as well on the bill with Metallica, Scorpions, Van Halen, I think, from memory. I was there, but I don't remember it very well. So Dokken, absolutely brilliant band, tragically overlooked, although so they are still going. They never really achieved the heights that they should have, and there are a number of bands that I would put in that category as well, and a number of them are actually featured within my record collection. But anyway, that'll do for today. We've had Def Leppard, Dio and Dokken, 3 of the D bands in my D collection, and there are quite a few more to go yet. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please like and subscribe and tick all the buttons downstairs. I'd really appreciate your help. And in the meantime, stay grumpy, keep on rocking, be good. See you soon. Ciao.